I do. Okay, so this will be the, I guess, the time is called.
Good morning. My name is Ken Ferraro, and I'm director of the Center on Aging and the Life course, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium, Age and Social Connectedness. Welcome. Glad you could make it out this morning. We organized today to start with the poster sessions, and I believe they'll be up during the break later, so if you didn't get a chance to speak with a presenter of the posters, you'll have a chance later on. And I also hope you'll stay with us throughout the morning. We have a special announcement we're going to make at the end of the morning, so that should be a fun time as we conclude. The theme for today's symposium has attracted the interest of scholars for decades. The idea of social connections and among older people is very, very important to sociology as well as to gerontology. I remember as a graduate student reading papers from the 1960s and 1970s asking the question, why is it that older adults have fewer social contacts? Is it simply a function of mortality, selective mortality, or is there something else going on? And there were some raging debates about disengagement theory and activity theories and discussions about, well, why does this occur? And I think the research that was spawned from that debate has greatly informed us about the value of social relationships in later life. So there's a considerable body of research now that shows that people who have socially supportive relationships actually live longer. They recover more quickly from surgery and from injury, and they have a number of other benefits for their health. I oftentimes talk about physical activity as an elixir. You know, if you're not doing well, get exercise, get physically active. You know, it's a good thing for you. And maybe the same argument or a parallel argument could be made for physical activity that involves social relationships. Or maybe just social connections could also be an elixir, right? There's a lot of evidence that social relationships, meaningful social relationships, are salubrious. The challenge, however, is that we know there are some complications to that premise, right? Sometimes one complication is that those relationships aren't what we thought they were going to be. What one of our speakers refers to as the negative side of social support, or the dark side of social relations. We get into relationships and we thought it was going to be one thing, and we find out, it's not exactly what we thought. The second thing is that there's a tremendous concern, not only in the United States, but in Canada and in Europe, about the decline in meaningful social contacts among humans, not just older adults, but also for younger people as well, that we have questions about where we're headed and how our society is organized, and are we getting sufficient meaningful contacts. The United Kingdom in 2018 created a minister for loneliness, right? Recognizing loneliness as a social problem in the UK. It was not due to Brexit, but it was chronic loneliness. Canada is reporting similar sorts of things, and there have been studies done over the years that are showing that there's a increasing number of people in the United States who say that they do not even have one person in whom they can confide. That's striking. That's startling. So we gather today to ponder these issues about age and connectivity, not just electronic connectivity, but that social connectivity. Questions such as, do most people have at least one person with whom they can confide? Is our society becoming more age segregated? I like to talk to my undergraduates and remind them that they actually live in a youth ghetto. And I get their attention, right? And then I explain to them that I'm probably the oldest person that they see for months at a time. But we do live And there is such a thing as homophily. We like to be with people with similar interests or similar ages, but maybe we need a little more age integration. Other questions, do all these electronic communications that we have, are they a suitable replacement for the face-to-face interaction? And then something that really intrigues me is, are there distinctive benefits by helping others? There's a lot of research on volunteering and doing good for others that suggests that maybe we're actually triggering hormones such as oxytocin that we refer to as the cuddle hormone, that is actually a warmth that comes over a human being as they are engaged in maybe Habitat for Humanity or doing some kind of reading program for others. So we can't cover all that today, not in one morning, but we can cover some of it. So what we've done is we've invited two of the most eminent scholars in the United States on the topic of age and connectivity to speak with us today. I'm going to have my colleague Patty Thomas, Professor Patty Thomas, introduce our first speaker. Patty is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, newly associate professor. See that smile? Yeah. And a faculty associate of the Center on Aging and Life course. Patty, would you introduce our first speaker?
Great introduction, Ken. So we are very happy to have our first speaker, Dr. Benjamin Cornwell, who received his PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago in 2007. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Cornell University and faculty affiliate with several research centers, including the Center for the Study of Economy and Society, the Center for the Study of Inequality, and the Cornell Population Center. Dr. Cornwell's research focuses on the implications of social network structure and sequence processes for individuals and organizations, and in particular, how these processes shape social stratification. He's documented the role of social networks in multiple contexts, including health, risky behaviors, and access to resources. His work on sequence analysis explores how the ordering of social phenomena affects a variety of phenomena, including the stress process and the creation of social networks themselves. He's a co-investigator on the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, for which he devised a novel survey technique to collect the first nationally representative data on egocentric network change. And his analysis of these data has provided insight into how social networks change in later life and how such changes relate to life course events and well-being. Dr. Cornwell won the Leo Goodman Award for Best Mid-Career Sociological Methodologist from the Methodology section of the American Sociological Association in 2017. His American Sociological Review article on the social connectedness of older adults has been cited over 600 times, and his research on the dynamic nature of social networks in later life has been covered in dozens of media outlets, including CNN, the Huffington Post, MSNBC, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Chicago Tribune, to name a few. We are so excited to have him here today and to learn about his research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Cornwell.
Thank you. Thank you, Patty, for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful symposium. Actually, I can't remember how many times I drove through West Lafayette and stopped many times as a graduate student at Chicago because my family lived in Cincinnati. So this was actually a very convenient midpoint stop, but it's nice to actually visit campus. It's a beautiful campus, and spend a little time with you all here. So I know many of you, I know your work, and it will be, I think, to my benefit to get some of your feedback on what I'm going to be presenting today, which is a piece that we recently received an R&R at Journals of Gerontology, Social Sciences, ongoing work that I'm doing with Ed Lauman, Alyssa Goldman, and Phil Schum at Chicago, which focuses on this issue of how social connections change in later life. Okay, so let's begin. So over the last dozen years or so, most of my work has focused on the issue of social connectedness in later life. It's one of the more interesting time periods for studying network dynamics. later life is inherently a dynamic time, and it is a very interesting time of the life course for understanding how social connections change, both in terms of network ties and ties to the community. Okay, so I'll start with my research motivation. There's been a lot of interest, of course, as Ken said, in the relationship between social ties and health, both talking about physical health, mental health, and a variety of other aspects of well-being and social support. We know that it's very important to study for those reasons alone. More recently, there has been an interest in studying not just how socially connected older adults are, but how their social connections change over time. A couple reasons for this. Of course, the basic reason that we want to know whether older adults are losing social connections because it has a variety of potential health consequences. There's also the question of how change in social connections unfolds. Are there people who are disengaging? Are there also people who are increasing their social connections? And what do those patterns look like? We really don't have a very good sense. But it's important to study because there is evidence from some of the research that has emerged in the last few years that those changes, that is how people experience changes in their social connections, have independent consequences for things like health, net of their baseline social connectedness. So for example, the very experience of increasing social connectedness can have health benefits because it involves a variety of cognitive and physical changes that people have to experience in order to explore new venues, to get out, walk around, and try new things. So this idea of changing social connections has some important potential consequences. Problem is, we really don't know much about how social connections change, what those trajectories look like on a nationally representative or population-based scale. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. It's interesting that when you look back at the history of social gerontology, sociological research on older adults' connections, that some of those early theories were focused on the nature of change in social connections, not on the question of how connected are older adults. Do they have social ties? The question, for example, with respect to social disengagement theory was to what extent do older adults lose their social connections and why does that happen? The theory, of course, being that they engage in some mutual agreement that they're about to drop off the twig, and so they're just going to start disengaging from their social connections. And that is functional and that helps society, and so everyone agrees that that's the way it's going to go. This was an inherently dynamic theory. Socio-emotional selectivity theory, also inherently dynamic, a theory which echoes that concern about older adults voluntarily giving up their social connections, although in a more selective pruning of network ties. Continuity theory, which will come up later, and activity theory, the idea that older adults respond to to changes in their everyday lives, later life transitions like bereavement and retirement. And the question is, how does that response unfold? Again, a dynamic and inherently dynamic question. And that ties in, of course, to other life course approaches in social gerontology. So in this talk, I'm going to be discussing a variety of forms of social change, change in social connectedness. We're interested not just in older adults' connections to the community, religious involvement and volunteering and those kinds of things, but also their connections in social networks, their access to close confidants, and internal changes that can unfold within their networks, which we know are important from our research. This particular example shows the change over 5 years in the egocentric social network of a 70-year-old woman who was interviewed at Baseline in 2005. I don't know if you can see this in the back. On the left is the Wave 1 network. She's married. She has a very dense, close-knit network. It's comprised mainly of her children and her husband entirely, in fact. She is widowed between waves 1 and 2, and you can see how her network changed. The internal structure, the composition. She is now closer to her sister. She has some friends in there and also is connected to family. But the network itself has lost some of the strength and density and become more expansive and less comprised of kin. We're interested in that, as well as we're interested in levels of connectedness, because we know that these things have implications for health above and beyond levels of social connectedness. Okay. So to reiterate, we are interested in the extent to which older adults are socially connected in a variety of ways, how that changes over a period of time. I've been analyzing these data primarily using the National Social Life Health and Aging Project, on which I'm co-investigator, which is a nationally representative sample of over 3,000 older adults in the United States between the ages of 57 and 85. Wave 1 was collected in 2005. Wave 2 collected 2010, 5 years later, roughly, with a good retention rate. And Wave 3 collected in 2015. And we've just been funded for Wave 4 as well. There are some interesting components to the data, including collection of a battery of questions about social connections, marital history, job history, biomeasures of various types taken from saliva and blood and anthropometrics. And it's just a very rich data set. At Wave 3, we started recruiting a second cohort. So at Wave 4, we'll have 4 waves of data from our baseline and also 2 waves of data from another cohort. So we'll be able to look at age, period, cohort type issues. Today, I want to focus on the measures of social connectedness. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show what we're finding over those 3 waves with respect to sequences of changes in older adults' social ties of a variety of types. I'm not going to be showing any regressions where I'm predicting this or using it to predict an outcome like health. I just want to present a very simple, straightforward sense of the distribution of these patterns of change, because this is something that we really don't know about, and I think it's inherently interesting, even if it's not connected to an outcome like health. So the aspects of social connections, which I'll be looking at here, include measures of egocentric network composition and structure. And this is information that we get from respondents where we ask them to name up to 5 of their most important core confidants, their most important, the people with whom they discuss important matters. That very strong, elicits very strong ties, and they give us the names or initials of those people. We ask them a variety of questions about those people. Are they kin ties? How often do you interact with them? Do you go to them for advice about health? And how connected are they to the other people in your network? So everyone reports on their connectedness to, their network members' connectedness to each other. So that gives us a sense of the internal density or structure of the network. We're also looking at 3 forms of community social connectedness: frequency of involvement in religious services, frequency of volunteering, and frequency of involvement in other groups in the community. So general questions. And then the last piece of the talk, I'll focus on this issue of social network turnover, and I'll get to that in a moment to give you a sense of how much change is occurring within the personnel that people regard as core network members. So again, in the back, if you can't see this, I apologize, but along the left, you see the 7 core measures of social connectedness that we're looking at. And all this table does is it shows levels that were observed for the baseline respondents at each of the 3 waves. So you can see, for example, that at baseline, the average network size, confidant network size, was 3.5. It's 3.8 at 2010 and 3.8 at 2015. which reflects the general finding, which is something relatively interesting, that most of these older adults are increasing the sizes of their networks over time, or more increase rather than decrease. But as I'll say later, there's also a lot of stability in these measures, and that's, I think, the main takeaway point of this table. Across most of these measures, the general overall levels of social connectedness appear relatively stable. There's no sort of drastic drop in social connectedness among our baseline respondents over this period of time, although it's worth noting there's a little bit of decline with respect to volunteering and organized group involvement, which to some extent is attributable to health problems, functional disabilities. So this gives us an important early substantive insight that I want to highlight, which is that overall levels of social connectedness among baseline respondents remains relatively steady, do not show much deviation from baseline. Over the next few slides, what I'm going to do is break down what happened sequentially over the three waves. So we have these measures of connectedness, community involvement, network connectedness, a variety of measures. And what I want to do is I want to look at what happens between waves 1 and 2. Did they experience a decline or an increase or stability in their social connections between those two time periods? And then what happened in the subsequent wave period? Was decline followed by decline? Was there evidence of ever-increasing trajectories of connectedness? How is this sort of sequentially patterned? What is the organization of these changes over time? So sort of digging in and getting a little bit more sense of the sequential unfolding of changes in social connectedness. So this first slide, I'm going to skip that one. This first slide shows what happens to people who experienced decreases in these measures of social connectedness between waves 1 and 2. And what did they do? What do you see reported from them between waves 2 and 3? So there are a couple of things I want to point out. For example, of those people who experienced a decrease in confidant network size, that's the first row, of people who experienced decreases in confidant network size between waves 1 and 2, the modal experience, reported by 63% of the sample, is an increase in egocentric network size between waves 2 and 3. Sort of counterintuitive, but I'll show you how that comes together in a moment. Likewise, 58% of people who experienced a decrease in frequency of interaction, this is the second row, 58% of people who experienced a decrease in frequency of interaction with their network members between waves 1 and 2 experienced an increase in frequency of contact with their network members between waves 2 and 3. And you can see similar patterns with respect to kin composition, with respect to the measures of community involvement, which are at the bottom, the three rows at the bottom. For the most part, the shaded cells are the modal experience. Either people who experience a decrease either experience an increase between waves 2 and 3, or they're experiencing stability between waves 2 and 3. Okay? So decrease in connectedness does not usually get followed up by decrease in connectedness, sort of this sort of descent into isolation that you would expect given something like disengagement theory. Okay, so stepping back, the main takeaway from this first table is that the overwhelming tendency for people who experienced a decrease in some form of social connectedness between waves 1 and 2 was to report a countervailing increase or stability in that same measure between subsequent waves. Okay. I'll just quickly cover this slide. This shows people who between waves 1 and 2 didn't report any change in their levels of connectedness of these various kinds. For them, the modal experience, the shaded cells, tend to be an experience of another period of relative stability between waves 2 and 3, as opposed to being followed up with a period of increasing connectedness or decreasing connectedness. Okay. And the last table Let me talk about people who experienced increases in different forms of social connectedness between waves 1 and 2, and what happened to their social connectedness between waves 2 and 3. Here again, we see a tendency toward countervailing trends. So if you look down that first column, people who experienced an increase in, say, frequency of interaction with network members between waves 1 and 2, 54% of them reported a decrease in contact frequency between waves 2 and 3. Similar patterns emerge for the other measures, except for network size, which I will talk about in a moment because it's sort of its own animal. So to pause and step back, I've shown some general patterns of sequential change over 3 waves with respect to 7 forms of social connectedness. The general tendency is for those forms to remain stable over the 10-year period. People who report stability between waves 1 and 2 tend to report stability between waves 2 and 3. But it is also clear that the modal tendency is for people who experience either an increase or a decrease in connectedness. They experience a countervailing change in the subsequent interwave period. So altogether, this is over a 10-year period. We're looking at these patterns, okay? Okay, so there are other ways to think about the issue of trajectories of change in social connectedness. One related issue is this issue of the composition and the internal structure of the social networks that are actually being reported. Talked a little bit about overtime trends and kin composition, but I haven't talked much about the actual experience and reporting of turnover within the membership of the networks, because some of these changes in, say, aggregate kin composition between waves may not actually be capturing the underlying sort of turbulence that happens within networks when people replace old network members with new ones. So I want to talk a little bit about that process of turnover and what it looks like in our data. So the way we approach, because this helps us understand a little bit about the issues of coordination and support and density and social control that becomes so important for older adults in later life, and the coordination of between siblings to help their mothers, as somebody here was presenting on earlier. Where are you, by the way? Yes. So there's this interesting question about how do network members interact with each other, and how is that coordination happening? And I think looking at turnover in networks is one way to get a sense of that. So starting at wave 2, what we did was try to get a sense of changes in the personnel of networks. So starting at wave 2, what we did was we first asked respondents the question that we asked everyone at wave 1 as well, which was, who are your core confidants? They listed them. We recorded that and saved that. And then at wave 2, once they had given us their wave 2 roster, we were like, okay, 5 years ago, this is what you told us. This is what your network looked like. These are the names. And we showed them side by side and invited them to illustrate for us which of those network members were the same as people who were listed at wave 1. So we have sort of a matching. It was actually a very successful exercise, very little error in this, and people actually enjoyed this. Actually, this is one of the more interesting parts of the survey for them. And it happened right at the beginning of the survey. And so we get a sense from starting at wave 2 how much turnover is happening within these networks. At wave 3, we did the same thing, but we showed them their wave 2 and their wave 1 confidant rosters and asked them if they could link those up. So we have a sense of whether, for example, somebody who was dropped between waves 1 and 2 was resurrected at wave 3, and so on. But it gives us a sense of this turnover issue and how much of that is happening. Okay. I'm going to skip the Venn diagram. All this really does is it shows you confidants who are named at wave 1. That's the leftmost circle. And the circle next to it on the right is the overlap with confidants who are named at wave 2. And the circle at the bottom right is confidants who are named at wave 3. And you can see how they're overlapping. How much overlap is there overall with respect to network members named at these different times? This little tiny sliver in the lower left gives you the number of people who are resurrected from wave 1 to wave 3. There aren't many, but it's not trivial. But in general, good amount of overlap, but a lot of change. Also note that the wave 3 circle is larger than the wave 1 circle, which reflects the general growth of these networks over time. More people named. Okay, so let me give you a sense of the patterns of change that we observe in older adults' networks over time. This is an important slide, and I apologize if you can't see it very clearly. This lays out the patterns of change that we saw. So just comparing, doing the exercise at wave 3, how many of those network members are new versus old, how many were lost, how many were gained. The lower right axis shows you the number of new confidants at wave 3, that is, did they name anybody who is new since wave 1? Are all of the people new since wave 1? And compare that to the number of wave 1 confidants who were lost, which is the lower left axis. And just to help you read what's happening here, this very front bar, the lower front bar, shows you the number of respondents who lost all 5 of the confidants that they named at wave 1 and added 5 new confidants by wave 3. Wasn't very common, but it happened. Other things I want you to read here, just to help you see, those purple-gray bars there in the middle, that ridge, that reflects people who both lost and added the same number of confidants between waves 1 and 3. So this is what we would call equal turnover. Their networks remain the same size between waves 1 and 3. And I might add, of all of the people whose networks remained the same in terms of size between waves 1 and 3, 80% of them experienced some turnover. So the size remains the same despite some turbulence within their social network. But the modal tendency here is for this ridge experience of equal turnover. The greenish, yellowish bars on the left, that area reflects people whose networks grew net over time, whereas the reddish pink bars, sort of danger area, reflects people who lost network members net over time between those two ways. And then there's this tiny little yellow bar in the very back, and those are the people who neither lost nor added anyone over time. Their networks remained exactly the same. Not many of those people. So the norm tends to be one of change. So that's what I want to point out about this. Very, very interesting set of findings. I want to emphasize there's both a lot of change happening in older adults network, yet a tendency toward turnover or at least some kind of compensation happening over time where there's a little bit of rebalancing happening. So one last question, a general empirical, how am I doing on time, by the way? Good, perfect. So one last general question that I have when I'm looking at this is I'm thinking, okay, so we did this exercise with respect to community connectedness, measures of kin composition. When people experience a decline in one of those over time, what happens in the subsequent time point? We can do something very similar with respect to the network change data. That is, we can get into it and look very closely at if people experience an increase in, with respect to they added network members over time, but they didn't lose any, or they added some, but they didn't lose any either, and they added, was there equal turnover? What happens with those things between waves 1 and 2, how are they followed up between waves 2 and 3? Are we seeing similar patterns? Are people, again, do we see any evidence that people who lose network members between waves 1 and 2 also tend to lose network members between waves 2 and 3? How does that work in a sequential fashion? Okay. This shows the network change turnover figure, which I just showed, which was between waves 1 and 3, but this breaks it down so you can see on the left the patterns of network change between waves 1 and 2, and on the right, patterns of network change between waves 2 and 3. And I just want to show this to reiterate the fact that the patterns that we're seeing are basically the same between waves, except that in the period between waves 2 and 3, there's a little bit more of an uptick in net losses. So there's a little bit more of a loss of network members, and versus what we saw in between waves 1 and 2. And likewise, the ridge, the equal turnover pattern increases a little bit, which is interesting. Okay. The main thing I want you to see here is that there are very similar patterns in both interwave periods. So regardless of whether you're talking about the 2005 to 2010 period or the 2010 to 2015 period, you basically see the same set of patterns, modal experience being one of unchanging network ties driven by this turnover or replacement pattern. I also want to emphasize that there's a lot of change happening in older adults networks, and it's very difficult just to look at these aggregate statistics of change in kin composition or change in network size. There's a lot of turbulence that's being masked by those kinds of simple comparisons. Okay, so when network structures move in a given direction, do they tend to self-correct the same way that community connectedness seems to? So when you look very closely at this, you see something similar to what I have already shown. And let me just show you how this is laid out. What I've done is I've broken this down in terms of the type of trajectory that we saw between waves 1 and 2. That's arrayed down the left side. There was no change in their network, again, relatively rare. They lost some people but didn't add any. They lost people but added some, but fewer. The equal turnover, which was the most common. They added people but also lost a few less than that, and they only added people. And then mapping that against what happened between waves 2 and 3 to see what's going on with respect to the sequential patterning of this issue of network turnover. A few things I want to point out. For one, that in the middle there, equal turnover is the most common experience, obviously. But it's very interesting to see that equal turnover between waves 1 and 2 tends to be followed by equal turnover between waves 2 and 3. People get into this, there's sort of a churn or something that seems to be relatively stable, the rate of turnover or churn within people's networks, where the most common experience is to follow this churn with churn. So people get into a pattern or an environment that produces this pattern somehow. Another thing I want to point out is the general similarity to the earlier tables that I showed with respect to how people who are experiencing losses or net losses overall, those top two rows, or the second two rows there, tend to follow those experiences with net additions in the subsequent two waves, between the subsequent two waves. So for example, of people who only experience losses, the most common experience between waves 2 and 3 is to only add people. Vice versa, people who only added people between waves 1 and 2 also tended to lose people between waves 2 and 3. So something really similar is happening, and something is happening here in across these measures, which suggests that there's some kind of rebalancing happening in these people's social structures. What does this tell us? So when older adults experienced some trajectory of change that deviated from stability, the subsequent time period was usually characterized by countervailing experiences. In the end, people end up with very similar sized networks to those that they started with. no matter where they were in the original scale. Okay, so I want to go through some preliminary conclusions, and I'll talk about limitations in future research and some key takeaways that we can draw from our analyses. So I think the findings, first of all, have some important implications for some of the earliest theories in social gerontology regarding the types of changes that people tend to experience in later life with respect to their social connections. The first general conclusion is I see very little support for social disengagement theory in these data. Bear in mind, we started with a group of people, I didn't spell this out very clearly at the beginning, but a group of people at wave 1 between the ages of 57 and 85. So we wanted to get a range of people who were sort of before entering that later life period and how this transitions through retirement and so on unfold. But by 2015, 2016, we're dealing with people who are in their 60s and mid-90s. So these data include information about people who are in their 50s and all the way through to the 90s. So most of these people maintained similar levels of connectedness over time. More people experienced increases in connectedness than decreases, which I think is important to think about. And among those who did experience some kind of network change, more experienced an increase in network size and more expansive networks than vice versa. The overarching pattern, I think the more important takeaway, the thing that we're really trying to focus on in this paper, the more important pattern that comes out of these data is one that was often, especially several decades ago, referred to as homeostasis. So this refers to the tendency for systems to maintain themselves over time, and Ed Laumann, being a tried and true structural functionalist, has always argued that we've sort of prematurely abandoned this perspective that there's a tendency for structures to maintain themselves. Happens through a number of mechanisms. Karen will talk about some of this when she talks about compensation later. But the tendency is for aspects of social connectedness, whether you're talking about community involvement or network connectedness or patterns of change in social connectedness, the tendency is for there to be this kind of rebalancing over time and a norm of experiencing countervailing processes. You experience an increase, you experience a decrease. You experience a decrease, you experience an increase. People get used to a way of living, perhaps, routines. They're embedded in a social environment that has the same opportunity structure. There's just a variety of reasons why we might see this evening out over time. We see something similar in our data to this idea of homeostasis, and it appears to be reinforced through two related mechanisms, and not getting to the substantive aspects of agency versus structure, just the idea that, for one, people tend to maintain pre-existing levels of connectedness. So there's a maintenance issue, a continuity issue, which is talked about a lot in the literature, where people are adapting very quickly to a change. Second, people who experience network losses follow them with network additions, relatedly, and taken together, the result is relatively stable social structure despite a lot of turnover. So on the one hand, there's a sort of tendency toward stability. On the other hand, when there's not stability, you get this thing happening with the rebalancing. So how does this speak to existing theories in the social sciences? The most valid theories, according to my understanding of the literature, are those that deal with the issue of continuity and adaptation. So to me, this issue of how people respond to loss and the idea of compensation and rebalancing is way more relevant than the notion of any kind of selectivity or disengagement. And I think it does happen. There is some disengagement, especially related to health decline, but it is not as common as stability and rebalancing. Okay, we're increasingly referring to this, by the way, I want to point out, we're increasingly referring to this as an issue of homeostasis or rebalancing as opposed to just continuity. In my opinion, continuity seems to call to mind the idea that things remain stable over time. We do see that, but we also see the rebalancing happening. And that gets to the issue of compensation after loss. What it doesn't reflect, this is something that I think would be an interesting area of research in the future, is what happens when people experience an increase in social connectedness. They tend to respond over a long period of time with a countervailing decrease. So yeah, people want to be socially connected, but to an extent that they're used to, that they're comfortable, that the environment will allow them. So this idea of increases being followed by decreases is not, I think it was as well emphasized in the literature on continuity and activity. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about limitations, because I think limitations are the best way to find future research directions. This is one nationally representative data set. It's focused on the United States. They're high quality data, but they're limited, obviously, to this social context. Limited in the sense that we're only looking at confidant networks. We're not able to get information on weaker ties, which is an important issue as well if you're talking about independence and access to resources. And we don't have more than the three measures of community connectedness. So we're obviously just looking at a small subset of measures of social connectedness, but something that is useful nonetheless. We're unable to say anything about institutionalized older adults, which I think is important. I think it would be very interesting to do a study of nursing homes and assisted living facilities, and how does social connectedness unfold there, where the person is seen as sort of the recipient of changes of the environment around them. Is that the case? How do people respond to that? Is there any kind of attempt at rebalancing within that strict circumstance? Relatedly, one thing that interests me increasingly is the issue of context, neighborhood context, the experience of disadvantage, and how is that playing into this? There's some really interesting work lately in how experiences of network turnover differ by race. I have a theory that people who are in disadvantaged environments and people who are themselves disadvantaged also have a different experience with homeostasis. That is, that they're perhaps less able to respond to changes, or their environment affects how those patterns unfold over time in important ways that need to be documented, and could give us some insight into perhaps race differences, for example, with respect to health outcomes in later life. So that would be really interesting. I also want to acknowledge that our sample is highly selective, and this is probably the most important thing. We did some propensity score weighting. We tried to adjust for attrition due to things that happened between waves 1 and 2. But this is a study of survivors, and there's no other way to look at it. This is a study of people who have survived between waves 1 and 3 over a 10-year period through later life, the 90-year-olds, the 80-year-olds in the study in particular. So it's important to think about what happens to the people who don't make it to that point, and what is their social connectedness like? What does that look like? Do they experience different patterns? And could that experience of different patterns help to explain why they didn't make it? Okay, and finally, key takeaways. Even with the limitations, hopefully, maybe perhaps because of the limitations, this analysis has provided some food for thought. If later life is not a time of loss and disengagement, but instead a struggle to restore or rebalance, or an experience of homeostasis, how does that happen? What are the mechanisms? Again, we could get into things like agency and structure to talk about that. And does this change much the way we theorize later life social connectedness? Is there a new theory here? Is there a need to revisit older theories that have perhaps been abandoned too quickly? But more research is needed in order to answer this question and explore the extent to which these patterns hold in other contexts. Thank you. And I guess we have time. How much time do we have for Q&A?
About 19 minutes.
Perfect. Jill.
Yes, 1 second.
Okay. Am I supposed to stand up too, Ken? Oh, okay. Ben, this is fascinating. And I had a question, which was, we know the structure of men's and women's networks differ considerably across the life course, especially across the adult life course. And I'm particularly interested in general how these patterns differ by gender, but particularly those, what I would think of as the lost gain people, because I would expect they'd be much more likely to be women, but maybe I'm totally wrong. So I'm very curious what you found looking by gender, especially for that dip-up pattern.
One thing I'll say is that it's a prescient comment because it's probably our next project. So it's something that I have not dug into and is exactly where we want to go with this and the disadvantage piece or things we want to look at. And then there's a third piece on neighborhood context, which we're thinking about. But my experience with with that question, at least with respect to the NSHAP data, is exactly what you said. There's a difference. Women tend to be more open to an expanding network. They're partly because they're more likely to experience the situations that would lead to a disintegration of a dense network. Like they are more likely to lose the structurally equivalent actor of the partner. And so the dense sort of family network is more likely to break apart in their experience. So my guess is we are going to see those patterns differ by gender. They're probably, the question for me would be, are they more likely to follow an increase in social connectedness with a decrease? And maybe that's something that men are doing and women are doing more of the opposite. I don't know. But I think it's an interesting question. It's important, and I think we're likely to see some gender differences. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask one more, just to follow that? How much do you think this graying of divorce, do you think it will play, do you think it's too small of base rate phenomenon to really affect this, but do you think it may play any role?
I don't know. I can't answer that. It's just one thing that brings to mind, though, is this idea of the networks changing by, and I start to think about agency and whether people want to change their networks, and is divorce perhaps one of the mechanisms by which they're sort of rebalancing or changing something. I don't know. That's a good question. It probably does play into it, and it'd be great to look into that. With Wave 4, we just got funded for Wave 4, and we're going to be getting a second wave for the new cohort. We might be able to look at that because we're replenishing with younger people, and we'll be able to do a little bit of analysis of that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating talk. So one of the factors that I'm seeing when you look at those multiple histograms is that you limit up to 5 as it looks like a saturation point. I may be wrong. But if you were to take that histogram and stratify by, say, education level, would you see the same numbers? It gets at something of the limitation of the socially disadvantaged, but I think it's a really interesting question because it drives down to how many options do you see in your life course?
Right.
And therefore, have you looked at that lens from the perspective of, say, educational strata and the numbers? Because is it the numbers that we are born with almost in our family of origin that says we can only deal with 5 people because we had 4 siblings and a parent, or 2 parents and 3 siblings? Yeah. Or is it that really at a certain stage in the U.S., and I'll say in the U.S. because I do a lot of research outside, this is it. This is the limit, and how much does education play in that or background?
It's a good question. A couple of things to unpack there. One, I would say this does get at the question we want to look at with respect to disadvantage and the idea that there are some interesting dynamics with respect to that. I think that the dynamics of that, I think there are real differences between groups and their ability to, or their experience of homeostasis. There's a lot more turbulence in the networks of people who are lower socioeconomic strata and racial minorities, according to the data that we've looked at. We can only look at that turbulence to an extent, to the extent that we have data on these very small networks. And the confidant networks are useful because they give us a sense of meaningful ties, and these are networks that we know affect health, but they're also affected by this sort of the ceiling effect thing. Most people, there are very few people in our sample who who didn't name anybody in their confidant network. There are a good number of people who named, who filled all 5 slots. So we know that there are people outside of that network that are not being named, and Ed argues that this is an aspect of environment. To some extent, the churn that you see happening among people who have 4 or 5 network members is incidental to the structure. They're just naming the first 5 of the 10 people, and the next time when they name 5 people, the network maybe hasn't changed much, but they're just cycling through a different set of names, whoever they talked to yesterday, or something. So to some extent, that's an important issue. I do think that the same sort of rebalancing or compensation is happening in the network. It's not just incidental to say that churn that we talked about, because we also see it with the community measures of community involvement, volunteering, and organized group involvement as well. So I think there's just a similar, general pattern, a sequential pattern that ties those together. But it's an important issue that we need to address actually in our revision. Which is one reason why this is actually a really fortuitous time for this talk, because the R&R, one of the questions that we have to answer when we do our R&R is, how is this not just regression to the mean? So there are going to be floor and ceiling effects. If you experience an increase between waves 1 and 2, maybe that's because you hit the ceiling. You can't go anywhere but down from there, so maybe the decrease is a reflection of that. That's the one piece that we need to deal with. We'll probably deal with that by doing a supplemental analysis where we just cut out the people who are at the floor or ceiling and see if we see the same thing. Yeah, so that's probably what we'll do. Yep.
Again, of course, really interesting talk. I'm really interested in your idea about this stability despite turnover. One thing that struck me about the profiles that you gave is that, and I don't know how typical these are, but they were really significant ties that were falling out. So in the first case, a son disappears in a later network, and then another, a sibling called Ava disappears. So, I mean, what about the issue that maybe not all ties are equal, and that this stability despite turnover isn't neutral? It could be really a very negative impact if you're losing it or become estranged from key people in your family.
That's a great question. One thing we don't have access to is information about the dark side of social ties, negative connections. I would love to look at this. I imagine that turnover is greater in those more tumultuous families where siblings don't get along, maybe brought on by the fact, brought on by a health problem of the parent or something. But I think that idea leads us in an important direction, which is the need to understand the valence of the ties. We do know that, so in wave 2, we asked people why, if they dropped someone between waves 1 and 2, why did they drop them? It was open-ended, very short responses, so we didn't get a lot of data. But the information that we did get suggests that most of the ties, when people say they lost someone, they say things like, so one reason is people died. It's not the most common, but there's some death. One common response is, we're still in touch, which suggests it's ambiguous. You don't know whether that means that it's a weaker tie now, or actually I meant to name them but didn't. So that's a possibility. And there is some research on that. Again, getting back to this idea of churn and just naming incidentally other people. The other most common reason for loss was residential mobility. So when they didn't name somebody at wave 2 that they had named at wave 1, I want to say it was something around 15 to 20% had something to do with change in residence. Now, it's that makes sense, but one reason why I think that's interesting is it gets at this idea of disadvantage in the social environment. Disadvantaged people have more turbulent neighborhoods. They're characterized by low tenure rates, that is, a lot of turnover due to lack of ownership, higher rates of foreclosure, family members who are incarcerated, higher rates of poor health among their network members, and a variety of things, but many of those have to do with a change in the actual living position vis-a-vis one's network members, and that is a very real source of loss for people. I'm reminded of work by Matt Desmond, for example, and his work on foreclosure and the levels of turnover and disposable ties, he calls the types of ties that people who need to make it ends meet via their social connections. And Alice Goffman wrote, obviously, that controversial piece on the Run, which has the valid and interesting insight that people who are disadvantaged move through their social environments very quickly for reasons that are beyond their control much of the time. So that notion of loss of close network members, that issue is probably closely tied to social disadvantage. I would like to see how that plays out, but it differs. The reasons for it differ by people, by
Just
background.
briefly, though, can you say, how about the opposite of disadvantage, right? There are certain ethnic groups and immigrant groups that actually have a real culture toward you should maintain ties, you should
Yeah.
stay in touch with grandma. Do you see any of that in your data?
It's there. I haven't looked at it, but I know just sort of anecdotally talking to students who have looked at the data, they've said, for example, Latinos are known to have denser networks, or that's the tendency in the egocentric network analysis in the data. But I haven't actually looked at the rates of turnover by that ethnic status, which I think would be very interesting. And we don't have very fine-grained data on race ethnicity. It's basically just black, white, Latino, other. Yeah.
So to follow up on the fascinating talk and very interesting and sharp data, follow up on the previous question and just to stay on the dark side a little bit more.
Good. More interesting that way.
So I do research in elder abuse, and we know that most of the abusers, perpetrators, most likely is someone you know and someone you're close to. So looking at the connections that stay over time, could some of the ties, in fact, even though it's part of your inner circle and you're trying to stay close to them, but it's actually harmful?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point. We have some colleagues who have been studying elder mistreatment. And the question that comes to mind when I think about, bring it back to the issue of network change, the question that comes to mind for me is the possibility, are the networks changing as a reflection of somebody else's interference? So networks, an egocentric network is a sort of delicate mechanism. It can change for a variety of reasons. It can be because you want it to change. It could also be because of something that somebody else is doing. I think about parents and a child, an adult child, and offspring, and the way that that person might kind of, in some situations, control the network. We talk a lot about gatekeeping, for example, in network analysis, which is important, which is a concept that comes to mind when you say that. Could it be that when we don't see homeostasis, when we don't see replacement or compensation, that it's actually a reflection of somebody who's not allowing new ties in? And there's also the question about how that relates to network density and the internal structure of the network. I would expect that an abusive, and we can do this with the network data. We do ask, is there somebody who mistreats you, and are they one of your network members? So you can see how, and which one is it? So we can see which position they occupy in the network. Are they part of a dense cluster, or are they like a separate, very rarely are they a sort of separate person. It's more often somebody who knows the other network members, as I said, family member, adult offspring. And is that followed up by some kind of unique signature of change in the network over time? That's a really interesting question. Yeah.
I would love to work together.
Send me an email.
Hi, thank you. There's a lot to think about here. I had a couple of questions about the methods. So how this gets filled out, is this just the
Yeah.
older adult on their own, or is it the same, is there a person associated with them that stays stable that helps them fill it out? Because I'm just wondering about kind of, if you see the 5 lines in front of you, if it's
Yeah.
contributing to homeostasis, like, like I should fill these, just kind of how this goes.
So-
and
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So we're very. This is, first of all, I didn't get a chance to talk about this. In-home interview, usually about 2 hours long, computer assisted. So long partly because we do so many biomeasures and biomeasure breaks and things. But I'm pretty sure that we don't allow somebody to sit at the table. It'd be an interesting question. I think what we do is when there's a question about the person's capacity to answer these questions by themselves, we'll do a proxy interview. And I know the interviewer at the very least marks down whether there's some kind of to what extent were there people in the room when these questions were being asked. That's a good question. Like, what could I look at? And the interviewers provide all kinds of data when they leave, which actually turns out to be a really cheap way of getting data. Have them fill out information about the environment and what they saw and all that stuff, because you're not paying a respondent for that. It doesn't hurt your response rate. But that question, like, is there somebody in the room, and how does that affect sort of stability in the network? Good question. I haven't looked at it, but there aren't that many. I know there aren't that many proxy interviews, and we don't interview people. If they're institutionalized, we get a proxy interview, but we don't usually. My understanding is there's not usually like a partner helping out with the answering. So I'll look into that, but I don't think there's really that much of a.
I think that'd be just great, because I think the same way as like the neighborhood context piece, I think the context of the filling could be super interesting, and whether there was conversation around it. So even if you have a way of just like notes that went with the interview, I think that would be like, qualitatively, you could look at that a lot of different ways. And I guess my second question about that was, what did you do with people who have some form of mild cognitive impairment, where they're probably still likely living in the community and maybe stayed in place, but it could really affect things like their connections? Like, how do you handle that?
So
do they stay in, or?
Yeah, so a couple things about that. One, cognitively impaired individuals, we started with a general assessment of that and did not interview people who had severe cognitive. We don't want data that have all kinds of, first of all, we don't want to give the burden, put the burden on those people, but also we don't want those data. They don't make sense if it's somebody who doesn't know what they're answering. Another interesting issue about cognitive impairment, which I think, which comes up in some work that I've done, is it's an interesting question about where we see a strong relationship between cognitive impairment and social network structure. What happens is cognitively impaired people's networks tend to close in on themselves, and they're surrounded by people who all know each other, because there's a lot of coordination around people who have dementia. And you always have to have somebody there, and they have to be talking to each other when they sort of trade off shifts. And so their networks end up being very dense. Even with the early evidence of mild cognitive impairment, we start to see that. It's something that I've talked about in other work. But there's a question about, to what extent are the network reports a reflection of the relationship between health and network structure, or to what extent is it reflecting poor reporting, measurement error on the part of people who are cognitively impaired? It's a good question.
Thank you.
How much time we have? Last question? Is that it?
Join me in thanking That was wonderful. I have 2 quick announcements. One is that we have a break. The second is that the clocks in this room are not synchronized. So this will be the correct clock, okay? 10:26. Be back 10:26. Thank you.